On a freezing night in Racine, Wisconsin, Saturday, January the 31st, 2004, a chilling 911 call came in. A woman trapped inside a garbage can filled with snow managed to call for help. She whispered that her ex-husband was trying to kill her. As she lay imprisoned in his truck, not knowing where he was taking her, the freezing cold snow pressed around her. She feared for her life. This woman was Teri Jendusa. Born in the mid-60s in Wisconsin, Teri had a happy childhood in a stable family. She was close to her three siblings, lively and full of energy. After high school, Teri attended the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. It was here, through mutual friends, that she first met David Larson in 1983. They often hung out with friends at local pubs, enjoying each other's company. However, their relationship remained purely platonic. It wasn't until 1995, 12 years later, that Teri and David reconnected. By then, Teri had just ended a long-term relationship, and David had recently left the Marine Corps. Both were looking for something serious. Having known each other for years, it felt like the perfect match on paper. They shared a history, and both were ready to settle down. However, Teri later admitted she rushed into the relationship. She felt her biological clock ticking and ignored some serious red flags. David had a bad temper and a clear disdain for women, which she overlooked. Though his anger made her uncomfortable, it was never directed at her, at first. He was more of a Karen toward hospitality workers like waiters, clerks, and cashiers. Teri was embarrassed by his behavior, but never imagined that one day she would be on the receiving end of his rage. For a while, Teri wasn't directly affected by Dave's troubling behavior, but things changed quickly after they married in April 1996. Just 4 days into their honeymoon in Hawaii, Dave hit Teri for the first time. His reason? He didn't like what she was wearing. When she refused to change, he struck her, declaring that now they were married, she had to do whatever he said. He even told her she was bought and paid for. After returning home, there were brief moments of calm, but with someone like Dave, the good times were always followed by dark ones. His behavior grew more abusive over time, both verbally and physically. Dave believed that their marriage was a contract in which Teri had agreed to follow every rule he set. To him, failing to comply meant she deserved punishment, often through extreme violence. Throughout their marriage, Teri tried to leave Dave about 5 times. She would return only when he promised to seek marriage counseling or attend anger management classes. However, once things calmed down, he refused to follow through on those promises, trapping her in a violent cycle. It's important to avoid judging Teri for her decisions. Victims of domestic violence often face complicated situations, and Teri was no exception. Dave controlled every aspect of her life. He made her leave her job, cut her off from her friends, and stripped her of any financial freedom. He forced her to surrender possession of her car, took her car, which was registered in her name, and denied her any access to financial details. Teri was given $25 a week for her expenses, and she had to balance it and show the receipts to the authorities as proof. As Teri feared that there were no ways to escape from the power of her husband, she decided to accept all his requirements, follow all his orders, and attempt to do everything he wanted as well as possible. Persistent use wears off self-esteem, and the individual feels that they are at fault for the circumstance which they are not. Teri finally came to the conclusion that it does not matter how much she tried to be the ideal wife for Dave. He would always have something wrong with her. He would use any reason to lash out, holding her responsible for his own frustrations. By the time Teri had this realization and began planning to leave, she found out she was pregnant. She was thrilled to become a mother but knew the environment wasn't ideal for raising a child. Still, she hoped that becoming a father might change Dave for the better. While Dave did treat Teri better during her pregnancy, things quickly reverted after their daughter Amanda was born in 1997. Their second daughter Holly was born in 1999. But even the joy of becoming a father couldn't change Dave. Finally, during a fight in late 1999, Teri reached her breaking point. Accounts differ on what exactly happened. Either Dave screamed at their oldest daughter Amanda or pushed Teri while she was holding Holly. But one thing was clear: he had crossed a line by involving their children. Realizing she couldn't let her children grow up in such an environment, Teri decided to leave for good. She packed up what she could, took the girls, and went to a women's shelter while filing for divorce. But Dave wasn't going down without a fight. He stalled the proceedings, refused to provide documents, and even smeared Teri's name. He was held in contempt of court for dragging his feet, thinking he could manipulate the outcome in his favor. However, his attempts to badmouth Teri, cuss out judges, and defy his lawyer backfired. Finally, on January 31st, 2001, Teri was granted the divorce, severing her ties with Dave after 3 long and harrowing years. Even after their divorce was finalized, Dave remained in Teri's life. Despite Teri's accounts of her traumatic marriage, a judge awarded joint custody of their daughters. This meant that Teri still had to see the man who had terrorized her during court-ordered custody exchanges. Dave insisted that these exchanges take place at his home, refusing to meet in public despite Teri's pleas. It's unclear how he was able to dictate these terms, but it forced Teri to regularly confront the past she desperately wanted to escape. This constant reminder of her nightmare left Teri convinced that she would never date or marry again. She wanted to focus solely on herself and her daughters. But as they say, love finds you when you least expect it. Just before her divorce, Teri joined the Bel Canto Community Chorus, where she met Nick-Nicolai. Nick was immediately drawn to Teri, but he respected her space during her divorce. Over time, their friendship blossomed into romance. Nick was kind, respectful, and empathetic to everything Teri had endured. He also embraced her daughters wholeheartedly, treating them as his own. By May 2001, Teri and Nick officially started dating, and after 2.5 years, they married in October 2003. Teri finally felt like she had the stable and loving family she had always dreamed of. But how did Dave feel about this? Not great. In his mind, despite the finalized divorce, he and Teri were still married in the eyes of God. He believed Teri had betrayed him and God's will by remarrying. This led Dave into blaming Teri for the disruption of the family and vowed to make her suffer for it. On the day they left the court after the divorce had been granted, he told her that one day she would wish that she had not divorced him. Teri, although already being afraid of her ex-husband at this point, believed she had already suffered the worst that he could bring upon her. Unknown to her, that was not the end of it, for Dave had more in store for her. All Teri wanted was to leave that life behind her, and she was doing just that. She had found a new husband who was such a nice man. She had started to try and rebuild her career, and the day before, on January 30th, 2004, she and Nick found out that they were going to have their own child. They were happy, as were Holly and Amanda, who had been longing for a new addition in the family. Teri and Nick could not wait to see the girls the next day to tell them and celebrate with them back from Dave. Saturday, January 31st, 2004, marked the 3-year anniversary of Teri and Dave's finalized divorce. It was a bitterly cold day in Wisconsin. Freezing temperatures, high winds, and snow covered the ground. People described the weather as so frigid it made breathing difficult. But the cold was the least of Teri's concerns. All she could think about was seeing her daughters and telling them about the new baby. As she prepared to pick up the girls from Dave's, Nick offered to go with her. However, Teri declined, knowing that his presence could make things even more tense with Dave. She wanted to avoid any unnecessary confrontation. On her way to his house, she called Dave to let him know when she would arrive. But when she got there around 10 a.m., Dave informed her that the girls weren't ready yet. Annoyed but not wanting to argue, she asked him to hurry, deciding to wait outside in the freezing cold. For almost 20 minutes, Teri paced the driveway, trying to keep warm. Finally, Dave opened the door, but her daughters were nowhere in sight. Instead, Dave came out and told her that the girls were hiding and wanted her to come inside to find them. Immediately, Teri felt uneasy. Dave hadn't allowed her into his house since the day she left him, so his sudden invitation was suspicious. But the bitter cold and her desire not to disappoint her daughters overcame her doubts. She brushed off her suspicions and entered the house, playfully calling out for her daughters as she made her way through. Almost instantly, her uneasy feeling turned to panic. Teri's worst fears were confirmed the moment she felt a searing blow to her head. She didn't realize it immediately, but her ex-husband, Dave, had struck her with a baseball bat. As she collapsed to the floor, Dave continued his assault, striking her repeatedly while yelling, "You always said I was abusing you. Now you can see what abuse really is." He hit her upwards of 20 times until she blacked out. When she regained consciousness, she found Dave binding her with duct tape from head to toe. Panic set in as Teri realized he had something terrible in mind. Desperate, she tried to bargain with him, promising to drop their custody battle and child support, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Dave was instead fixated on a twisted idea. At some point while he was taping her ankles, her pants had come down, and he became irrationally convinced that Teri had done this deliberately to make him look bad. Further proof of his deceived mindset. Once he'd finished binding her, he placed her bruised, bleeding body into a trash can, packed it with snow, and loaded it into the back of his truck. On one of the coldest days in Wisconsin, he left her half naked, beaten, and covered in snow, showing no mercy. Despite the horrendous situation, Teri clung to a sliver of hope. In his frenzy, Dave had overlooked one crucial detail. Teri still had her cell phone in her jacket pocket. Though her face was covered with duct tape and swollen so badly that she couldn't open her eyes, she managed to break free from the tape around her wrists. Somehow, she wiggled her phone out of her pocket and dialed 911. Knowing it would be nearly impossible to speak clearly, Teri repeatedly relayed Dave's address to the operator, over and over again. Her efforts paid off as it was enough to get the police and rescue dispatched to the scene. By the time they arrived, however, Dave had already loaded Holly and Amanda into his truck and left the house. As the police responded to Teri's call, they unknowingly drove right past Dave's truck, with Teri still bound and hidden in the back. Her vehicle was hitched to the truck, and Teri could hear the sirens fade into the distance. A feeling of defeat washed over her. It seemed they had missed their one chance to save her life. When officers arrived at Dave's home, they were under the impression that someone inside was in distress. With no answer at the door, they forced their way in, only to find the house empty. Meanwhile, neighbors started gathering, and through their questions, the police quickly learned about Dave and Teri's troubled history. It didn't take long for them to realize they were dealing with something far more serious than they had anticipated. However, they had no clear idea of what exactly had transpired. Teri, meanwhile, was fading in and out of consciousness. Despite her critical state, she managed to call her husband Nick, struggling through the duct tape that covered her face to explain what had happened. Nick was horrified but knew that the best way to help her was to quickly alert the police. So they both hung up and called 911 again. Nick reached the same Racine County dispatch center that had received Teri's first call, and the pieces began to fall into place for the police at Dave's residence. They started to see the full, grim picture of the situation. Teri's second call, however, was less successful. By this time, Dave had crossed into Milwaukee County, and the dispatcher there was unaware of the danger Teri was in. Listening to the call, it becomes clear that the severity of the situation was not fully understood by the new dispatcher. It's understandable that 911 dispatchers need to emotionally disconnect to cope with their high-stress jobs. But there is a crucial difference between emotional disconnection for self-preservation and a blatant disregard for the well-being of the caller. In this case, it was unfortunately the second, contributing to the continued risk Teri faced. Teri's second 911 call left many stunned and angered. The operator apparently thought it was a prank, an explanation that hardly justifies her dismissive and venomous tone.
Hello? Can I help you? My husband is trying to kill me. Your husband's trying to kill you? Does he have you handcuffed or what? Masking tape. Masking tape? Then how are you holding the phone? Do you want to talk to me or do you just want to deep breathe?
For anyone listening to Teri's voice on that call, it was painfully obvious that something was terribly wrong. Yet instead of compassion or urgency, Teri was met with skepticism and dismissal. Many sources covering this case choose to gloss over this call, but it remains a glaring example of a critical failure in what should have been a lifeline for Teri. Despite the horrifying situation she was enduring, Teri continued to fight for her life. When she regained consciousness and realized they were still moving, she stuck her hand out of the garbage can, waving it desperately in hopes of attracting the attention of a passing driver. Unfortunately, it was Dave who noticed. Infuriated by her attempt to save herself, he pulled over, struck her with the bat once more, and threatened to shoot her if she tried anything else. As if that weren't enough, her cell phone rang, and Dave snatched away her one link to the outside world. She was now completely isolated. Realizing her situation was terrible, Teri made the decision to play dead, hoping to convince Dave that she was no longer a threat. As he unloaded the trash can from the truck, she lay motionless, faking death. Dave's plan was to leave her for dead in a storage locker. He wheeled the trash can into the unit, duct taped it shut, pushed it into a corner, and piled boxes on top of it to ensure she was completely trapped. He then left, slamming the metal roll-up door behind him, sealing Teri into what he believed would be her tomb. Meanwhile, the police were ramping up their efforts back at Dave's house. With time running out, they knew they had to act quickly despite having little to go on. They issued Amber Alerts for Holly and Amanda, put out all points bulletins for Dave and Teri's vehicles, and attempted to ping their cell phones. They also conducted a more thorough search of Dave's home, which proved challenging due to the extreme hoarding conditions. The house was filled with old food, dirty dishes, laundry scattered on the floor, and clutter everywhere, with narrow walkways just barely allowing navigation through the space. Would the police piece together enough information in time to save Teri? Or had they already missed their only chance? During their search through Dave's chaotic house, the police made a disturbing discovery. They found Teri's pants, covered in duct tape and blood, along with a massive blood stain on the carpet. The size of the stain suggested that whoever it belonged to, presumably Teri, was in critical condition. Time was clearly running out. If they didn't find her soon, they feared the worst. Despite their best efforts to stay focused on promising leads, every direction seemed to result in dead ends. By nightfall, the police expanded their search to include every place Dave had ever been, hoping something would finally break. This turned out to be a fortunate decision. As luck would have it, they spotted Dave heading to work, casually driving as if nothing had happened. They quickly pulled him over, anticipating a confrontation with a violent and unpredictable man. But when they approached, they found Dave remarkably calm, collected, and most importantly, alone. Teri and her daughters were nowhere in sight. Dave played the role of the bewildered ex-husband to perfection. He acted completely unaware of why the police were so eager to find him. The officers decided to play along, taking a non-confrontational approach. They invited him to the station, saying they had a few questions to clear up some confusion. Surprisingly, Dave agreed without resistance. In the interview room, it became clear that Dave felt untouchable. His arrogance was palpable. Within a few minutes, he told the police that Holly and Amanda were safe at his girlfriend's house. He claimed that he had dropped them off because Teri had failed to pick them up that morning. Then Dave launched into a lengthy tirade about how terrible Teri was, insisting she was the real villain in their story. He ranted about how she had put him through hell for years, completely oblivious to the gravity of his situation. The police let him talk, knowing that sometimes the best way to uncover the truth is to let someone lie until they trap themselves. As Dave tried to paint an innocent picture of his day, he began to create inconsistencies. He was setting the stage for his own downfall. Dave sat down and began recounting his day, painting a picture of a devoted father who had made breakfast for his daughters and patiently waited for Teri to pick them up. According to him, he had waited until 11:30 a.m. before finally giving up and taking the girls to his girlfriend's house. He seemed confident in his story. Unfortunately for him, that one detail would be his undoing. Teri's first 911 call had been placed at 10:57 a.m., and the police had responded to Dave's house by 11:03 a.m., a full 27 minutes before the 11:30 a.m. that Dave claimed he had left. And when the police arrived, Dave wasn't there. This contradiction was a glaring hole in his story. Once they caught him in this lie, the police didn't hold back. They confronted Dave with everything they had: the blood found in his house, Teri's pants, the 911 calls. They hammered him with the mountain of evidence, and as they did, they noticed something shocking. Dave was sitting there calmly answering their questions while wearing pants stained with Teri's blood. He hadn't even realized it. When the detectives pointed this out, Dave scrambled. He tried to change his story, attempting to backpedal as fast as he could. He created a new tale on the spot. He claimed that while packing his daughter's school bags that morning, Teri had somehow snuck into his house, dropped her pants, and attacked him with a hammer. He said that he saw her just in time and was forced to immobilize her with a baseball bat in self-defense. From there, he claimed he blacked out and had no idea what happened next or where Teri was. The detectives weren't buying it. They reminded Dave that it was bitterly cold outside and that if Teri was still alive, time was running out. They appealed to any remaining shred of humanity he might have had, asking him to think of his daughters. But Dave just smiled, yawned, and said he needed a break. He was, in essence, telling them that no matter what, he was determined to ensure that Teri would be dead by the time she was found. It was a shocking display of cold-heartedness. Despite being caught red-handed, literally, Dave showed no concern for Teri's life. His animosity toward her was so intense that he was willing to sacrifice himself just to make sure she suffered. The detectives realized they were dealing with someone who would rather go down for murder than give up his twisted sense of vengeance. Could the investigators find Teri in time despite Dave's stubborn silence? Or would Dave's twisted resolve seal her fate? During the interrogation, Dave requested a break, which due to legal protocols had to be granted to avoid the interrogation being considered coercive. While investigators were obligated to comply, this break turned out to be advantageous for them. While examining Dave's personal belongings, investigators stumbled upon a significant clue. Among the clutter of his wallet, which contained business cards and receipts from various places, they found a business card for his storage facility located in Wheeling, Illinois, nearly 60 miles from Dave's home in Wisconsin. This seemed out of place and suspicious, as it was unusual for someone to store belongings so far from home. Despite the possibility of innocent explanations, time was of the essence. Desperation led the investigators to follow up on this lead. They contacted the storage facility and learned that Dave had indeed rented a unit there and had accessed it just hours after Teri's disappearance. This discovery intensified their suspicion, and they decided to investigate further. The facility attendant was asked to check the storage unit for anything unusual. After a tense wait, the attendant reported hearing sounds that suggested someone might be inside. This was a critical moment. Investigators instructed the attendant to call local law enforcement immediately, and Racine County Police set out for Wheeling, knowing that every second counted. As the Wheeling police arrived at the facility, they were prepared with a pry bar to force their way into Dave's storage unit. The urgency was visible, with the hope that this lead was not a dead end. Upon entering the unit, their initial optimism lowered as they observed only boxes, shelves, and a trash can. It was the trash can that ultimately caught their attention. It was duct taped shut, which led them to believe that if Teri was in the storage unit, she would be inside this trash can. The officers proceeded with caution, removing the tape and opening the lid. Inside, they found Teri, bound with duct tape, bloodied, and barely alive. She was curled up in a fetal position, frostbitten, and in a state of severe hypothermia, with her body temperature having dropped to 86 degrees. Despite her terrible condition, having survived 27 hours in such horrific circumstances, Teri's survival was nothing short of miraculous. She had lost a significant amount of blood, suffered severe frostbite, and was in a critical state physically and mentally. But what wasn't immediately apparent was the full extent of her internal injuries. Her blood pressure and respiratory rate were dangerously slow, and her kidneys were failing. Despite these grave conditions, Teri was rushed to the hospital on February 1, 2004. Her medical team was initially not sure about her chances of survival, but against all odds, Teri began a slow but remarkable recovery over nearly 2 months. Although she lost all 10 toes to frostbite and tragically miscarried her and Nick's baby, her survival was proof of her strength and resilience. Dave Larson was tried and convicted on multiple charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, obstructing child custody, and interstate domestic violence. He is currently serving a life sentence. In 2010, he attempted to appeal his conviction, claiming double jeopardy, but the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his claim. Determined, Dave tried to escape from prison using a complex plan involving a fake medical emergency, but he was unsuccessful. In addition to his prison sentence, Wisconsin ordered Dave to pay $3.4 million in restitution to Teri, as well as $300,000 to Nick, Amanda, and Holly. Dave's attempt to avoid this financial obligation by filing for bankruptcy was denied, as his debts were deemed the result of his own malicious actions. Dave continued to make legal attempts to involve himself in Teri's life, filing numerous requests for visitation with his daughters and for reductions in child support payments. These requests were consistently denied. Now, as Holly and Amanda are both in their 20s, Dave's ties to Teri are officially severed. Despite the trauma Dave inflicted on her, Teri has shown remarkable strength and forgiveness. She views Dave as the true victim of his actions, reflecting a profound glass-half-full mindset. Teri and Nick welcomed a son following her recovery. Today, Teri works as a public speaker, advocating for victims' rights and educating others on how to escape abusive relationships. She has played a significant role in drafting laws like the Wisconsin SAFE Act and Marcy's Law, and partners with Generations Against Bullying. Teri has truly become a powerful force for change and support for victims.